30 years ago, Sandy Drummond went from being a carefree, quiet labourer to all of a sudden out of nowhere becoming troubled. And then a couple of months later, he was found dead just yards away from his home. But before we get to the story, I'm Harley from All I'm Saying Is, and here we tell stories, from true crime to just strange urban fiction. This story is a true crime, and it does involve real people, it's a real true story, and it's a real true cold case. So if you are sharing it or you are commenting, and trust me, I do want you to do both, but please share it and use your sensitivity. 33-year-old Sandy Drummond of Bohill, Scotland, was born Alexander Drummond. He was a former Black Watch soldier in the Troubles of Northern Ireland, and after leaving the service, he moved in with his brother in Fallside Farm in Bohills. Bohills is a hamlet or a small village just 4 miles east of St Andrews in Scotland. He found a job at the Guardbridge paper mill, and there he was known to be a good worker, and he went on to work there for some years. He was often described as a bit of a loner, he was quiet, intelligent, and he didn't really have any enemies. He was an active guy, he liked to ride his motorbike, and he liked to go for long distance runs through the countryside. Sandy was also a kind man. See, his dad had Alzheimer's, dementia, so quite often he'd go around to his mum and dad's house, he'd stay at his mum and dad's house to give his mum a break from looking after his dad, and he'd quite often even send, or at least on one occasion, he sent his mum on holiday that he'd paid for so that she could have a break while he looked after his dad. He gave to charity quite often. On one occasion, he even donated a full week's wage to cancer research. He was an old-fashioned, working-class Scotsman bent on continuing his education. His mum thought of him as a carefree countryman, and others described him as quiet, steady, dependable, conscientious. He was just a nice, decent guy. However, in the months leading up to his death, this all changed. He became worried and he became conscientious. During the last months of his life, it was clear to his mum that he was troubled, and she'd often press him to find out what would matter or tell what's up, and he never really said. He just wouldn't tell her what would matter. However, his mum did notice that these troubles in his life, and when he became troubled, it was when he changed to a new position at the paper mill. But even after he transferred again to become a labourer, nothing much changed. On Thursday the 20th of June 1991, Sandy told mill managers, "Look, I quit, I'm done, I'm not coming back, I'm not working my notice period, I'm just gone." Now if you remember, I did say he'd live with his brother, and that is true for the time, but he still didn't tell his brother. He wouldn't tell his brother for another 3 days that he'd quit his job. And when he did tell him, he said, "I don't know what I want to do, I just want to get away, I might go and spend some time on my bike." At this time, he'd been working at the mill quite loyally for 7 years, so it was very strange and out of character for him to just up and move on. And like I said, at this point, he hadn't really got a plan of what he wants to do, or at least not what he finally told his brother. He just said, "Look, I'm done, I need to get away." So here's where the plot really starts to thicken. He'd been caught on CCTV numerous times visiting building societies around St Andrews in the days prior to his body being discovered. He was withdrawing huge chunks of his life savings, and he was stuffing it all into a holdall. So now he's got this huge holdall full of all his life savings. On Sunday night, the night before he died, and 2 or 3 days after he quit his job, he went to see his parents, and they only lived about a mile away from where Sandy lived, and he'd gone to see him, and everything was normal. He was back to being his happy self, back to being carefree. And he arranged to go back to theirs the next day for dinner, and then when he left, he kissed his mum goodbye, and then he rode off on his motorbike. However, Sandy would not return on the following day. On that next day, the morning of Monday the 24th of June 1991, his brother left for work at about 7:25. So 25 minutes past 7 he leaves, and a couple of minutes later a motorist sees this man run out of Sandy's cottage with a blue sports bag under his arm. He sprints across the road, jumps over the fence, and then he didn't see what happened after that. This man is thought to have been Sandy, but at the same time, or not long after, Sandy was seen heading for St Andrews on his bike, and later identified on security footage withdrawing cash. Then at 2:30 PM that same afternoon, a man was seen catching a bus not too far away from Sandy's house. And the reason this man caught witnesses' attention is because his hand had been bandaged up and it were all bloody, and there was something not quite right about this man. Something had obviously occurred. However, this injured man was never identified. He never came forward despite appeals, so no one has any idea who he is or who he was or what he was doing. Nobody knows. At 4 PM, a man matching Sandy's description was running down the road, and not long after, 45 minutes after, 4:45, two men were seen inside Andy's living room, and there was an orange rusty car parked outside. Sandy or someone like him was seen around Bow Hills at about 7 o'clock, and then at 7:15, a red hatchback car was seen reversing down the farm lane, and that's where Sandy was found 45 minutes later by an elderly walker. This farm track that this red hatchback had been reversing from, and then 15 minutes later Sandy had been found, were leading up to Sandy's cottage. When Sandy were found, he was found face down in the grass with his arms underneath him, like in front of him, and his legs straight out. He was just a few hundred feet away from his front door. At around the time, two men jumped out of a silver Renault 5 or Volkswagen at a bridge near where Sandy's body was laid. They jumped over the wall and ran in the direction of the farm track. When the police first arrived, they looked at Sandy's body, and because he's in this position where he's laid quite straight but his arms are underneath him, they initially thought that he'd been put there. But then as they looked a bit closer and there were no signs of violence, there were no signs of injury, the police believed that he'd maybe collapsed, and that's why his arms were in front of him, he was holding onto his stomach or something, and they couldn't see any other reason. So he's either collapsed and died of natural causes, or that he'd maybe committed suicide, maybe he'd poisoned himself. There was no outer physical signs that he'd been murdered, or even assaulted for that case. So it weren't until the post-mortem medical examinations that were carried out on him that they determined that he died from asphyxiation. He had extensive damage to his neck muscles, indicating strangulation, but there were no physical markings on Sandy's neck whatsoever, and there were no fingerprints, and there were no nail marks. The pathologist's suggestion was that it was a martial arts stranglehold. This is a very slow and painful death where the key arteries and jugular veins are constricted, cutting off blood circulation to the brain, and it's described to be worse than torture. And this would completely explain why there were no fingerprints, there were no nail marks. The killer wouldn't have had to use his hands whatsoever. While Sandy's strange behaviours leading up to his death seems like quite an obvious place to start the investigation, it's not actually all that helpful, because they couldn't find anybody that he'd had a falling out with or anyone that might dislike him. So they went to the paper mill and they asked all the employees there and questioned them. That didn't lead to anything. They scrutinised his army background. That didn't lead to anything. They scrutinised his pals from the army. That didn't lead to anything. The police could not find anybody that disliked him or that would have a reason to dislike him. It was just a nice, quiet, carefree guy. However, for reasons we'll discuss later, a fatal accident inquiry investigation did start, and that found that during Sandy's last few months, his life at work had been made hell by the people he worked with. And even stranger than that, and I think this is a really strange detail, especially for the timing, the night before he'd been murdered, he'd written down all of their names. Now, if you're thinking, wait a minute, he'd been withdrawing all his money, he was about to leave, he obviously had the money and someone stole it. I mean, that is quite an obvious explanation, it's an obvious motive. But that's all well and good until you realise that all the money that he'd been withdrawing had been found in his cottage. During the course of FIFE Police's investigation, it had been said on several occasions prior to his murder there'd been an orange or red Morris Minor parked outside Sandy's house. Some reports even suggest that the car had been outside the house twice on the Monday that he'd been murdered. However, it's still completely unknown whose this car were, where this car's from, where it's gone, so it's still no use. It's a complete mystery. The suspicious cars, the holdall that somebody had run out of Sandy's house with, the bloody bus passenger, all generated absolutely no leads. It's all information that's just led to nowhere. Following Sandy's death, his family were stunned and confused. None of it made sense, and all the suspicious events leading up to his death just made it all more confusing and mysterious. His mum was understandably heartbroken, but through all the suffering, it only powered her up more and made her more determined to campaign, and she campaigned really hard looking for answers. It's because of her that fatal accident inquiry investigation took place in the first place. That inquiry took place in Cupar in September 1992. However, other than the fact that his life had been made hell by some other colleagues, no other information came from that. Speaking in 1993, His mum said life after death of her son was agony. The strain makes me feel 1,000 years old. The longing to touch him and see him smile is unbearable. Sandy was the best son a mother could have. I was afraid for his life when he went to Northern Ireland with the army, but I never imagined he would be in danger at home. Despite tirelessly campaigning for information and to find out what happened, she never did get any answers and she died in 1996. In 1998, Sandy's brother said, "From the day Sandy died, it ran my mother's life. It probably killed her in the end." Also in 1998, Crime Watch recreated the events and appealed for information. They specifically asked for information on the orange and red car and some other bits of information, but nothing came to light. After 25 years, investigative journalist Michael Mulford claimed that the police had identified the killer. He said in 2016, officers identified what they could consider as a prime suspect during the cold case review of Sandy's murder. However, the possible killer was also dead. The journalist believes that the case has been kept open in case there were any accomplices that came into the light later on. At that time, Police Scotland and the Crown Office refused to say whether a prime suspect had been identified, but they did go on to say that the case was under ongoing review. That's all I've got for you on this case, I'm afraid, and it is a bit of a shame, but it's not a very well documented case, especially not as well documented as the other cases I've done. There's not as many news articles about it, and I think that's because over time less has come out. Pretty much nothing's come out, but I think the story's pretty clear. There was something going on in Sandy's life, and I don't think you can say it was just the fact that he was under pressure. I don't know Sandy's financial situation. Apparently his life savings weren't all that much, so you can't think, well, you know what, he's just going to move somewhere else and do something else. I find it strange that even if you're having a hard time at work, maybe quitting work and then trying to live off his brother's income while looking for another job is maybe one thing, or saying that he's going to go and look for another job somewhere else. But that's not what happened. Sandy said, right, I quit, I'm going away. Why? And why were he secretly withdrawing the money? Why did he not tell his brother after he'd quit his job or before he'd quit his job that he'd quit his job? Why did he wait until the Sunday, which was the day before he was leaving? Now, maybe I've watched too many action films, but it seems very strange to me. It does seem like he knew something bad was going to happen, or somebody was after him. Maybe it were drugs, but yeah, I mean, from the descriptions of people, you wouldn't expect him to be on drugs. Maybe he was just in debt. Who knows? I don't understand it. I don't get it. At the same point with a working man that's sharing a house with his brother, surely he can't be in that much debt. But I suppose if he were gambling, you don't know. You just don't know. But I think it's very strange, even more so, that this investigative journalist is claiming the police know it is, but he's dead. But why won't they release that? Surely that should still go to trial, unless they ain't got enough evidence for it. How does this investigative journalist know they know who it is? It is such a mind-boggling case, and the more I look at it, the more I think it sounds like a really strange riddle. Do you know where there is an answer, you just have to think really hard for it? But there's got to be some misinformation somewhere to make that answer a little bit more apparent, because at the minute it could be absolutely anything or anyone. Again, there's so many cars that were seen in the area at that time. Why? What were the guys doing that jumped over the fence and ran? Who was the guy that ran out of the house and what was in the bag? It just seems strange, and to me, the things like him getting out of Sandy's house and running over the road and jumping over the fence all says something to me like Sandy were planning something. You know? Sandy wasn't dead then, he was dead later on. Who are the guys in Sandy's living room? Does the brother know them? If he does, why haven't I been found anywhere that the brother said that he knows them? I could go on a rant for ages, I feel like I already am doing, so I'm going to leave it there. Please do put what you think down in the comments, just be a little bit sensitive, it is real people. Until next time, guys.